But then she makes a particularly disturbing noise at the end of it, which was to shout 3 times the word David. And as I say in the book, I managed to know enough to not rush into her bedroom and say, yes, I'm here. This is where, for anyone who hasn't read the book, they now might be thinking, if they've listened, oh, I see why you were in therapy.
Hello and welcome to the Spectator's Book Club podcast. I'm Sam Leith, literary editor of The Spectator, and this week I'm very pleased to be joined by the comedian and writer David Baddiel, whose new book is My Family The Memoir, which talks about, well, David, some of the material that you've covered in about your mother's unconventional sex life and your father's dementia, which you covered in stage show and television documentary. What was it that made you think there was something that was different that could be done with a book?
That's a good question. I felt that there was more to say about... I think essentially this is my origin story, this story about certainly my mother's affair and her immersion in the weird world of golfing memorabilia, which we will get to. That's what this is about, this book, as well as my father's dementia. And I think one is always retelling one's origin story as a writer in various different ways. I'm presently listening to Ian McEwan's Lessons, and it's very long and very good, but it's essentially his origin story. And I think it is something which I think is difficult to get away from, and particularly because your origin story, although it might seem something which is settled because it happened a long time ago, it isn't. It changes, and it changes because of things that were not happening when, for example, I did the stage show at the West End, such as my dad being dead. My dad was still alive with his dementia, and that was an ongoing thing. He's now dead, and that sort of changes things. And actually, it changes things in a very, very mechanical way, as well as a sort of emotional and psychological way, which is we hadn't really gone through all their stuff, particularly all my mother's stuff, at the point at which I did that show, because when your other parent is still alive, you sort of don't bother. You think like, oh, well, we'll sort out most of my mum's stuff, when he dies. And so it was just in their attic. And so when he died and we had to properly do it, I basically found hundreds of other letters, hundreds of other poems, tapes that my mother had made, recordings of her talking to her lover, and the sheer kind of intensity of her erotomania for this golfing memorabilia collector became apparent to me in a way that, even though I'd lived through it, and it is my origin story, I think it is my origin story as a comedian. It's what made me a comedian, is the absurdity, which we haven't really described yet, but I will in a minute, of my mother doing this. It sort of took me somewhere else. And also, I am at heart a writer, even though I'm a performer and I make TV or whatever. I am at heart a writer, and I think there is a complexity of how I look at it, how I talk about it, how I'm able to talk about the process of understanding your own upbringing, of judging or not judging the damage that can happen to you, indeed of writing a memoir that I can't do in a stage show or a film.
Yeah, you talk about damage. I'm kind of intrigued because you say quite often in the book, that you didn't actually find it as traumatizing or as damaging. You say, I'm almost uniquely comfortable in my own skin. I don't have, you don't feel as if this weirdness traumatized you. You also say, though, I spent years in therapy in my 30s. How do you square those two things?
Well, I am large, I contain multitudes, primarily. I think that, I think the primary thing, one of the primary things about the book is it describes many things in my parents' behaviour that are transgressive and not unconventional parenting, and indeed bad, to use a word. I mean, certainly in terms of their kind of parental neglect. I think both my parents, who were both only children, were solipsistic people and lived whatever their lives were and lived out their desires, whatever those might be, whether it would be my mother's for sex and particularly this sort of erotomania for a golfing guy, or my dad's wanting to express his total aggravation at all times without much thought about how their children might experience those things. But the key element of it is, and it is hard to know how much this is me now as opposed to me then, is that I find all that stuff funny and interesting and part of the rich and strange texture of my life, so that the book is celebratory of it. And I think at one point says, this is what makes this book different from Spare by Prince Harry, because he too had quite a transgressive childhood in quite a complicated family. But his book, which I've listened to, is full of rage and anger and bitterness and, good luck to Harry, because, he's expressing something that he thinks is important to him. But I don't think there's the notion in that book that I think I quote Leonard Cohen saying the crack is where the light gets in, meaning that we're all brought up in difficult, weird, sometimes probably not conventional or, useful for later non-damaged adult people. We're all brought up in weird childhoods. That's what family is. That's what Tolstoy said at the beginning of Anna Karenina, as you know. And therefore, I think that I, as a comedian, as a writer, think, isn't this amazing, is my primary thing, as I stand back at it at the age of 60. And at the minute you think that, you don't say, I'm furious, I'm angry, how could I have been treated like this?
No, it's a very loving book, I would say.
But that doesn't mean that I didn't have to go to therapy. I don't think.
But the extreme weirdness, I mean, we all know when you're growing up as a child, you don't really have any comparators. And was there a point at which you kind of went, hang on a second, this is not like the other children's home lives. Our house is weird. This thing that I've taken for granted as normal was not.
Well, I remember Frank Skinner saying to me much later on, he said an extraordinary thing, which I think is sort of true, which is he said there was a bloke at his factory, when he worked at a factory, who told him that his wife used to eat her cornflakes in such an annoying way that he wore a pair of headphones bigger than these every morning for breakfast. And after a while, that just became normal. And then Frank said, that's how Fred and Rose West start. Right? And I think he's right about that. I think that, not to say that family went that way, but that I think that, there are strange things that happen behind closed doors, and every little one of them is like an accretion as it gets normalised, and sometimes it can go very weird, very, very bad. In the case of Fred and Rose West, in the case of my parents, very, very strange as well, but obviously nothing terrible like that happened. But yes, by the time you've got to this point where my mother is receiving a letter from Willie Whitelaw thanking her for sending a golfing memorabilia book, when she showed no interest in golfing memorabilia at all, until one day this bloke appeared in our lives, and then next thing I know, the house is flooded with golfing memorabilia, and she has somehow become, over the course of quite quickly, like within a couple of years, the golfing memorabilia queen of North London. That's very strange, right? And there are other strange things, but that's the absolute heart of the strangeness. And I don't think I quite realised it was weird, because it began when I was sort of 11 or 12. And then you do just accept, okay, this is happening. And you probably don't question it that much. But by the time I'm 16, and I think it's hard to know this, Sam, to be honest, and this could be retro-engineering, but I think by the time I'm 16, I'm thinking it's funny. I'm thinking I've got the building blocks of what is essentially a comic detachment from my own world, which has served me very well over the years. And so when I am with other people's families, and they've got their own little idiosyncrasies, I'm thinking, yeah, it's not as much fun as our house. It's not as ridiculous. And so I'm kind of positive about it.
Yeah, there is a line somewhere in the book, and I'm trying to find it now because I've dog-eared the page, but where you say, I think you said that there's something that comedy does, or laughter does, is to sort of smash through all other... Yes, that's it. Laughter has a tendency to smash through what you're supposed to feel. And I was kind of intrigued by that in terms of, there are some quite strong other feelings involved in what you describe. I mean, does laughter then become an escape from what you're supposed to feel, do you think?
Well, Well, I think I put that in the book to some extent because, I'm obsessed, as the book makes clear, with authenticity. And that's partly because I think my mother was living an inauthentic life, but a very complicated inauthentic life. Because at some level, she didn't think she was lying. She thought she was obsessed with golf. The fact that she obviously was only obsessed with golf as a kind of side effect of being obsessed with this bloke, and then forgot that and just became a huge golfing person, that sort of never occurred to her to deconstruct. But it's inauthentic, and I think as a result of that and other things, I've become obsessed with authenticity. And comedy, I think, is a marker of authenticity, especially in a culture which is less and less authentic, because we live in a culture where people are, continually curating their likes and dislikes in order to look good. But comedy, even though it is assailed by that, at its heart, it can't be. It's the nearest thing art has to sport. Because if you go on stage and you don't get laughs, you have lost, right? And that's not true of a play. A play, can be basically shit, and every critic can say it's great, and it will get away with it. But really, you can't do that with comedy. It evokes a physical response, and I sort of love that about it. I love its cut and driedness, and so that's, I think, what I mean is that you can't pretend. Really, I mean, I know idiots sit at Shakespeare and pretend that they're laughing at the puns, but in general, people laugh without knowing why they laugh.
It's involuntary.
It's involuntary, and so therefore, I think if it happens in your own life about things that other people might say this is bad, right? This shouldn't have happened. You were abused, or things like that, but you start laughing at it, then it does undermines everything. I think I say at one point, yes, I was in therapy for a long time, but the whole time I was there, I was unable to quite take, I think I used the word gravitas. I was unable to apply gravitas to my own childhood traumas because of the intrusion of the words golf memorabilia. But as soon as they appear, it's quite difficult to take your childhood trauma seriously.
Well, it seems an open question whether that's a healing thing or not. Because it struck me, if you're, say, somebody you love very much dies in a completely ridiculous way.
Just dies because of a lot of memorabilia falling on their head.
Golfing memorabilia fall on their head, or they're trying to fish a Coke can out of a vending machine and it tips over and squashes them. A very undignified sort of thing. Does that make it harder, do you think, in the sense that you can't go, there is a sort of seriousness to my feelings that's massively undermined by the sort of penumbra of ridiculousness around it?
Absolutely not. And you know that, Strick. I mean, I felt you were, losing that argument as you said it, because there is nothing funnier than people who die in a ridiculous way. I mean, and also, I think later on, this is one of the stories I'm able to tell because my dad is dead, which he wasn't during the stage show. He's literally just died, and he's a corpse in his living room, and me and my brother are waiting there for 2 hours, sitting there with his corpse for a doctor to appear. And then when the doctor approaches his bed, the doctor accidentally presses a button, and the electric mattress that was, for his bed sore starts moving, and we can't stop it. We can't work out how to turn it off. And eventually the doctor brilliantly says, "I don't think I can pronounce him dead while he's moving." It's like, well, I'm not a medical man, but yeah, that sounds wrong. There's no way in the world I'm not going to put that in the book. But indeed, at the moment, it was happening, and I'm very upset that my dad's dead. I'm definitely enjoying that bit of black comedy, right? And I think, and we do live in a time, I talk about this quite a lot in the book, where laughter is considered to be just mockery, and comedy is just mockery, and it's used all the time on the internet. People are saying on social media, you're mocking someone and that's bad, as if laughter doesn't have 1,000 ways in which it can be expressed and received.
There's this punching down thing. I think you mentioned that, don't you?
I hate the whole punching down, punching up thing because, in my opinion, the moral geography of laughter is 360 degrees and much more complex than that, and more like quantum physics than a binary. But I think it's healing. I do think laughter is healing when someone dies. You want to laugh, and when terrible things happen, you want to laugh. And I am an atheist, but I do think the only thing that I would be prepared to accept that God has given us that makes us different from the animals is laughter. And so, no, I genuinely, I think that I was made into a comedian by having this childhood. I mean, I also think if you look at my brothers, my older brother's a comedy writer. My younger brother is, I think, quite damaged by it. And I think that's partly because he was younger and he wasn't able to apply the sort of comic distance to it. He just didn't have the maturity, I guess, and then the detachment to do that. And I think it's been more difficult for him, and he's definitely angrier about my mother's infidelity and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I think it's a really helpful way of dealing with stuff like that.
Well, can you give us a bit of a sketch of your parents' marriage? Because you've sort of talked about both of them, and they seem to be such kind of different people. I mean, as you say, your mother lives in this quite unreal, inauthentic way, and your dad seems to have been pretty authentic in as much as he was just really pissed off all the time.
All the time. I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess that's authentic. It's a bit maniacal. He was very one way of being, my dad. I think I described him in the book as someone who liked, food, football, and shouting, "Who the fucking hell is this now?" every time the phone rang. I mean, literally every time the phone rang. Anything that disturbed my dad's peace was aggravation. And he would express that very straightforwardly. Nothing seemed to basically be okay with my dad if it disturbed his... I want to say fragile, but nothing about my dad was fragile because he was very male, but nonetheless, he was just so quick to irritation. Unbelievably quick to irritation. I think that's just who he was. He was just a Welsh working class, quite angry bloke. I think as well as that, he had wanted when he was young to be a scientist. He was a scientist, but I think he wanted to be a research chemist. He got a PhD in biochemistry and went to America to teach, and I think had visions of himself as a sort of quite important research scientist, but because of the 1960s and having 3 children quite quickly, ended up working for Unilever and then being made redundant, so his career went down the pan. And my mother, that would be the other reason, is that my mother went mental, as far as he could see it, sort of in the mid-70s, becoming obsessed with golf. And the very...
Is that how you'd see it too? I mean, she comes across as a little bit crackers.
Well, I mean, one of the key issues that people have when they read the book or even hear the story in any way is, how could your father not have known that your mother was having an affair? Because I say he didn't, or at least I say he somehow managed not to notice it. And, I haven't explained this yet in this podcast, but not only did she meet this bloke who was a golfing memorabilia collector and then overnight turn our lives over to golfing memorabilia, she wrote hundreds of love letters to him, poetry to him, and she would leave these all over the house. She was always telling people that she was having an affair because, in a very 1970s way, she felt that having an affair was glamorous. She recorded his answer phone messages and would leave them on... I mean, everywhere the evidence was there, and somehow my dad managed not to notice it. And I feel that this wasn't a kind of, cuckold living in terrible denial. It was of a piece with my dad not wanting to be aggravated. Because it was like, well, this is just another madness that I can't be fucked with, so I'm just going to tune it out, the golf, whatever. That was essentially his attitude to it. She's the mother, which is what he called her. With the mother and the father. Oh, what the fuck the mother's doing, I don't know, golf, yes, whatever. It was that kind of thing. But obviously, there must be a psychological cost to all that, coupled with him, I think, feeling a failure. I think he felt a failure in terms of science. He was, however, my dad, very authentic. He was always who he was, which often was angry. And in this odd way that I think is quite complicated, I think he was more obviously affectionate, incredibly male, incredibly insulting, always taking the piss, unable to say it, but he was affectionate and loving towards the 3 of us in a way that was more straightforward than my mum was.
Do you have a sense of what the dynamic between them was before their marriage, as you describe in the book? There's one point at which they come very close to divorce and then pull back or move back in together, which is a kind of curious crux that you don't go into very deeply. I mean, it's kind of hard to maybe it's just hard to read it.
Well, I think I think that they were they're quite old by then, and also so idiosyncratic, and so they suffered, I think, from a sort of emotional inertia where they were sort of unable to really get away from each other or find anyone else. I think my mum probably thought that David White was still going to somehow ride into her life, and then he didn't. And by the way, there's always an element of lower middle class money issues to do with it. They basically sold their house, the one that we grew up in. They'd had loads of arguments about how the money was going to be distributed between them, and in the end they just shared it and moved in back together because that was economically easier than anything else.
But do you get a sense of before it all they started to go in these different directions of the love or whatever there was in their relationship before? What?
Yeah, I don't really go into that, and maybe I should have done, because actually, I mean, the book is, it's funny, and I think that's its top note, but it obviously does have poignancy in it, and I found quite poignant, but decided not to include it in the end, some very early diaries I found of my mother's, in which she's very excited to, be dating my dad in the early 60s, and talks about, Colin came round, and typically for my mum, who was always archiving and, as I say, a hoarder of her own life, there's reams of this stuff. And yeah, he seems quite a dashing figure initially in her life. Although I do know a story that they told, and perhaps should have told this in the book, but the book's long enough, that apparently they met at a Hillel House dance. So Hillel House was a thing, I think it still exists, where Jewish young people would congregate, students or whatever. My mum, I think, was a dental receptionist nurse at the time, and my dad would have been at Imperial College doing a PhD, and they met there at a dance. And my dad was very much not a dancer, but he did ask my mum to dance. And then apparently he said in a kind of gruff, slightly aggravated way, "Can I walk you home?" And my mum said, "What, now?" And they'd had like one dance. He went, "No, later." Like already slightly irritated with her. So, I think the red flag was there with him being irritated. But yeah, I think they probably were. I think they were in love. And maybe I should have made that clearer. But in a way, the book starts when my memories start, which is 1970, when we moved to Dollis Hill. And by then, they're not in love like that. They're in love like I think real love is, i.e. people who are mainly together and codependent, and their stories are each other's stories, but there is no Hollywood ideal there.
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
No, you quote a very poignant thing she says in what seems to be a rare, if not unique, moment of self-knowledge, don't you?
Yeah, I find that moment still very strange and odd, because, as I say, my mother was, I think, not a person of self-awareness, and self-awareness was something she was, if she had it, she was always pushing it away and into personas. But, yeah, there was a moment when I was probably, because I don't think I was living at home, so I must have been like 20. And I came back and they were arguing about something. And there was lots of slamming of doors and car doors because they were arguing in our front garden. And he went into the house and slammed the door. And my mother said to me, "It's so tiring living without an emotional life." And as I think I say in the book, that was shocking to me, not because it was, news. It was shocking to me because it was true. But that she had said something true and considered, and I think I say in the book, like, my mother had suddenly turned into Anita Bruckner. Like, there's this sudden drop of clear prose coming out of my mother's mouth, and it's very moving, and I think is important. Again, the book is. I did Loose Ends, the radio show, and the woman interviewing me, the producer of Loose Ends, talked to me quite a lot about how unjudgmental the book is. And then I think she said, I guess if you judge someone too quickly, then you're not interested anymore in why they were like why they're like they are. And I think that's true. I think the minute you say this is a bad person, it's a full stop on, anything else you might say about them. So I'm always interested in how the reasons for their behaviours can be illuminated more. And I think the primary thing with my mum is that she was born in Nazi Germany and had a notion of this glamorous life that she would indeed have lived, undoubtedly lived. They were very rich in the 20s. The Fabians, my mother's family, they were industrialists. They owned a brick factory. They had a society wedding, my grandparents, and they had servants. All obviously goes in the 1930s. And by the time my mum's born, they have nothing and they're fleeing to Britain. I think my mum's attempt to live a glamorous life, and it's tragicomic because obviously there are no Prussian princes in Dollishill in 1975, but the nearest thing she can find is a golfing memorabilia collector, which is poignant but hilarious. But I think also, she married someone who also didn't fulfil the Mills and Boon part of her in such an extreme way, because he was angry and Welsh and working class, and I mean, I think I described him at one point as sort of almost an animal, my dad, even though he's very clever scientifically, very clever, very cerebral, but physically like an animal, the way he had sex, because I could hear it, the way he would just fall
that's got to be quite alarming.
Yeah, so that was alarming. I mean, the noises that my dad made, I think I say, for years I thought there was a wounded walrus in my parents' bedroom, and a friend of mine who slept in my parents' bed thought that my mum had died because my dad was making such painful noises. And so
it's not one of these traditional situations, is it, where the sex in the marriage has dried up, so one of them goes elsewhere. This was a kind of twin trap kind of arrangement, if that's the way to put it.
Well, yes, I mean, they definitely carried on having sex because my dad, I could hear the noises, I mean, virtually every night in my bedroom, and some of my friends heard it too. And there's a fairly extraordinary moment, and this is a good example of the neglect I'm talking about, although also the comedy, because it's dependent on me happening to have the same name as my mother's lover, is that I hear my mother masturbating when my dad's not there, and she makes some of those noises, but then she makes a particularly disturbing noise at the end of it, which was to shout 3 times the word David. And as I say in the book, I managed to know enough to not rush into her bedroom and say, yes, I'm here. That would have been, I knew kind of what was going on. And this is where, for anyone who hasn't read the book, they now might be thinking, if they've listened, oh, I see why you were in therapy. I don't know if I can't remember if I say this or not, but I thought about that bit, which, is one of the most shocking bits in the book.
I think you said it gets the biggest intake of breath in the stage show.
In the stage show, it got a very big intake of breath, yeah. But I think what I thought was, it's odd how that, because I think you get consumed just with the comedy of that and the shockingness of it. But what I want to think about the neglect, because I was in the bedroom next door, and if I was having an affair with a woman called Dolly, my daughter's name is Dolly, but I would think as a father, you know what, I'm not going to shout out the words Dolly over and over again because my daughter is called Dolly and she's downstairs and she will hear. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes,
that's the difference.
One generation improving on the previous one, and all that therapy has started to...
Yeah, you see how we've progressed.
Exactly. That's a kind of fabulous instance of your, what you call your truth-telling obsession, or your, others would call overshare. Where do you think that comes from in you?
Well, I think my mother was shameless. There's no question about that. I think it's a weird combination because I think my mother was shameless, so she was always telling people about the affair. There's one bit where she's on Baddiel and Skinner Unplanned, and she boasts about the affair, and then unbelievably, she says, I'm talking about, she mentions having me having 2 brothers, and I say, I make a joke about that just means you had sex with my dad 3 times, and she says, how do you know they were all from your father? And he's in the audience, and she's on telly, right? It's unbelievably shameless at some level, isn't it? And I think, but what I think about that is, I don't know if it was true, because I actually think I don't know. I don't absolutely know. But I actually think we are all my dad's kids. But my mum wanted to show off. And she wanted to show off because she had this very sexualised notion. She actually says later on in the same programme, it means I had a good life. She thought it meant that, no, I'm sophisticated. I'm like a French woman who might have had an affair. How do you know, right? So I think I've picked up the shamelessness, but allied with something different, which maybe comes from my dad, which is wanting to tell people about me all the time, but wanting it not to be showing off, wanting it to be just true. Or always for it to be as true as possible. And I think I say earlier in the book, you know, there's quite a strong consciousness in the book of, you know, writing what might be considered to be a celebrity memoir and being slightly embarrassed about that. So there's a constant reference to what Alan Partridge might say. I keep talking about, and at one point I say this thing about saying I'm too honest, it's very Partridge. It's very like when celebrities are asked for their, you know, what do you think is your biggest flaw? They'll say, well, I'm just too honest. And it's very naff. But what I mean is not that. I mean that I think I am almost incontinent with the truth. And I'm just luckily have enough ability as a storyteller and a writer to frame it and structure that incontinence in a way that is entertaining and hopefully, you know, funny and interesting. But does come out of me. I mean, it's happening now, right? I'm not filtering what I'm saying to you. And I'm not thinking, how might this come across? I'm just saying it. And as such...
I think you quote your wife saying...
My wife said... once, have you ever thought about saying the second thing that comes into your head? And for her, it's really complicated because she's a deeply private person. So that's a strange relationship. I mean, it's a very successful relationship, but it's strange that we've hooked up together. But I think if you wanted to, you could say it's a combination of my mum's shamelessness and my dad's authenticity. That's where the truth urge comes from.
Yeah. Now, the truth urge often is kind of hedged around by all sorts of things, particularly when writing memoir, for like consideration for people who are going to be exposed in it, don't feel the same way. As you describe it, your brothers Ivor and Dan were not so wild about this project. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Well, as you probably know about me, I am an atheist, and so I do not have a concern really about all, you know, is this what I do write about that, and I consider it psychologically, is this what my parents would have wanted? But at some level, the only material concern about writing a book like this is how it affects the living. And the most important people, therefore, are my brothers, who lived through this and who, you know, are in different ways damaged by it, different to me. So I did speak to them. My younger brother just said, you're not doing it. And my older brother, who there's a whole chapter about my older brother, who I think of as, you know, salvational for me, my older brother, because I think, you know, not only was comedy my buffer against this mad childhood, but my older brother soaked up a lot of it and to some extent parented me, you know, in the absence of my parents and their sort of Olympian levels of neglect.
It's kind of moving, your descriptions of your older brother when you became famous for the first time.
Yeah, he said that he told me this very recently, that someone asked him how he felt when I first became famous, and he said protective, which is really moving, I think. And I unconditionally love my older brother in a way, which is not to say we haven't had arguments and all the rest of it, but I feel instinctively always unbelievably sort of grateful to my older brother because of, I think, the way he did care for me when, you know, he was unbelievably young and all the rest of it. But he said, look, I know you and I could talk to you for hours about this, just before I did the stage show, but you're going to do it, aren't you? And I think, possibly without knowing the quote, Ivor was basically referring to, is it Evelyn Waugh? You probably know, the sliver of ice in the heart of the writer.
Oh, yeah, Graham Greene, I think.
Is it Graham Greene?
I think a writer has a chip of ice in the heart. I think it's Greene.
Love Graham Greene. Or, as I do quote in the book, Nora Ephron, saying that everything is copy. He knows that about me, that I will use, particularly my own life, as material. But what he trusted me with is that I said, look, I think it will be an act of love. And, you know, the book, it begins with my mother's funeral, and it begins with many, many people saying to me that my mother was wonderful. And that rubbing up against my truth urge because of the fact that I thought, well, that says nothing about her. And the people saying this and idealising her like we do after people die, for me, it felt like a second erasure after death, because it's not bringing her back to life. What's the point of memorialising someone at a funeral if it's not in some level to make them live in the memory? And you don't do that by saying they were wonderful or they were lovely or whatever. You do that by describing them in as detailed a way as possible. And because they are people, that will involve flaws and idiosyncrasy and madness and all the rest of it. And so I said, I think I'm going to do it, but I think it will not feel like an assault. It will feel like an act of love. And, probably the most sentimental moment in the book, to some extent, is him coming to see the show, Ivor, the first time I did it at the Chocolate Factory. And I finish and I come out, and actually, I'm not sure whether I describe this or not in the book, but I do a Q&A encore, and there's lots of people there, I think maybe I do, who are important. Michael Billington of The Guardian is there, and all these other sort of drama critics and all these people. And I risk pissing them off because various people have got their hands up and say, sorry, I'm not taking any questions until I hear what my older brother thinks. What did you think, Ivor? And from the darkness, I heard him say, I loved it. And then he said, I loved it because it felt like she was in the room. And it's moving, but it's also, at some level, job done artistically. Because that was my point. My point was I want to show that you make someone live, not by saying that they're wonderful.
Yeah. Now, extraordinarily, the other David is still alive.
No, he's not. He's just died. He's just died.
So what you like about him then?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you. Do you want to know what happened with that?
Yeah.
It was quite interesting. So there's been some contact. I mean, in the book I talk about this email that I sent him when my mum died, which is towards the end of the book, is kind of a coda. But before that, during the stage show, the Daily Mail had contacted him. He lived in Slovenia and tried to get him to come and doorstep me at the theatre, the Vaudeville Theatre, which he didn't want to do. But his half-sister came to see the show 4 times, I think, Sue. And Sue...
Was that because you're taking notes for lawyers or because she really enjoyed it?
No, she loved it. Yeah. They had a complicated relationship. And Sue wrote to me quite recently. Well, actually, let me just dial back a bit.
Yeah, sorry.
No. What happened was, you might be interested as a booksman in this particular quandary. HarperCollins, who published the book, I had a big Zoom with their lawyers. And they said that we don't think David White, who at that point was definitely alive, could sue for libel. Because this is your mum's story, and you're telling your mum's story, and you have all the letters and all the rest of it. And anyway, it's not libelous to have had an affair anymore. It's not the 19th century. So that's all fine. But he might be able to sue for intrusion of privacy. He might be. And I thought, oh, fuck. And then the lawyer said the most brilliant thing. She said, but the thing is, this book is so funny, and it made me laugh so much, I don't think that any judge will take that seriously. They'll just laugh throughout the book, and his claim will not be taken seriously. And so it was no bit of it was taken out. But I could tell the publishers were still a bit worried. And I was probably a bit worried.
It's a marginally untried defence, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But then...
The book's funny enough, it crosses a thread.
Yeah, exactly. But then, about a week before it came out, and again, I don't believe in God, but about a week before it came out, Sue writes to me and says, I thought you should know, David basically rolled over at breakfast this morning. This is fine to say. I think he was 89, and he died. And I actually felt a little sad, relief probably that I wasn't going to be sued for intrusion of privacy, but a little sad because, to come back to the idea of this being my origin story, the 3 main players, which is my mum, my dad, and David White, have now exited the stage, and actually that's probably one main reason why I will not be telling the story again myself, although the book has been optioned for TV. But I'm not going to be writing that adaptation.
Did you get a sense of his reaction to it at all? I mean, because he must have been aware if the Daily Mail's up in his face saying, come and doorstep.
Yeah, I was a bit aware, but only through Sue. So Sue told me that the Daily Mail had got in contact, that David White had said he didn't want to come to London to doorstep me, and I'm glad about that. And I think what he had done is tell his sons, who are alive and could possibly be listening to this podcast, tell his sons about the affair. And I mean, he is dead, so I'm not libeling him, but I would say that David White was something of a classical con man. I think he was someone who exploited maybe vulnerable women, including my mum, for sex and for, money. There's a thing in the book where he tries to do a scam, a bit of golfing memorabilia fraud, and enlists my mum to help, and as a result they both get chucked out of the British Golf Collectors Society. I mean, again, a hilarious, utterly
Bonnie and
shit
Clyde
bit of, well, yes, I refer to Bonnie and Clyde as the example of, the sexuality of getting involved in a criminal endeavour together, except in this case it's some forged, with a photocopier, old golfing prints that my mum sold on his behalf. But I think he was a bit that. And so I think maybe he didn't want to uncover whatever Pandora's box might have been involved in, coming and saying, how dare you say this about me, because I think there might have been a whole host of other stuff.
Yeah. Can I just, we're running low on time, but what am I saying? The detail you've just suddenly brought to my mind. Your mum took the most brilliant revenge.
Yeah, I love that so much. Okay, so I should say, just in case anyone hasn't, because we didn't, well, I was sort of saying it in passing. So one chapter of the book is about a fraud perpetrated by my mum and David White. They were both members of a hallowed institution called the British Golf Collectors Society. And my mum was very proud to be a member of that. But unfortunately, she was asked to resign from it in about 1989 because David White had given her 2 prints from apparently 1905 by an artist called Hassal of golfing scenes. And my mum had sold these to one of her valued clients, because my mum, by the way, was a massively successful not massively successful, but quite successful golfing memorabilia person by now, and sold them for £5,000 each, a lot of money then. And she had taken a cut, and the rest of the money had gone to David White. And then the man had his collection valued a few months later, and they turned out to be laser photocopies put in an old frame, which is unbelievable. Unbelievable. Like, laser photocopy would have just been invented. So clearly David White saw an opportunity there. And how shit must they have been? But somehow or other they passed off this terrible fraud. And they both got chucked out of the British Golf Collectors Society when this came to light. The chapter is mainly about my mother writing to David White's golf clubs, he's a member of 2 golf clubs, to try and tell them about this in order to get him cancelled, as it were, from the golf clubs. And she writes these letters under an assumed name, which is William Wallace. You have to read the book. But anyway, yes, what you refer to is something which I love so much, which is my mother wrote 4 or 5 books about golfing memorabilia. One, Golf the Golden Years, she told me it sold 100,000 copies. I never saw any of the money from that, and neither did she, but that's what she says. Anyway, her last book was called The Source Book of Golf. And The Source Book of Golf is a book that is for the trade, not just for the coffee table golfing enthusiast. And what it is it's like Parker's. It's a sort of price guide to what you should spend on this 1950s Arnold Palmer statuette. This is what you should pay for it. And she told me, in a voice cold with fury, that she had deliberately priced everything too low. That's because she had been exiled from the golfing memorabilia world. This was a grenade chucked into their economic heart. And from now on, everything, they weren't going to resell anything at the real price. And I love that so much.
That's brilliant. It does bring her back to life. David Baddiel, thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Sam. What a joy.